Did you know that nearly 50% of democracies around the world have either collapsed or turned into authoritarian regimes in the last 100 years? That's a shocking fact, and yet, most people still believe democracy is the only system that works. But what if democracy isn't as perfect as we think? In this video, we're going to break down the harsh truth about why democracies fail. We'll uncover how, despite its promises of fairness and freedom, democracy often leads to division, corruption, and short-term thinking. You'll learn how politicians play the game to stay in power, why elections don't always reflect the people's will, and how the system is rigged against the average citizen. Stay tuned as we reveal the hidden flaws of democracy, flaws that could be the reason your country isn't as democratic as it seems. Let's dive in. Chapter 1: The mirage of majority rule in a democracy. We're told that the majority always has the power to decide. It's a nice idea, but it often leads to dangerous outcomes. The concept of majority rule assumes that what's best for the majority is automatically best for everyone. But, as history has shown, that's not always the case. A famous example is the rise of Adolf Hitler. In the 1932 German election, Hitler's Nazi Party was democratically elected with 37% of the vote. Although they didn't have a majority, they exploited the system and took control, proving that the majority doesn't always act in the public's best interest. This highlights the dangers of populism, where leaders can manipulate public sentiment to seize power. Studies show that when a population is deeply divided, majority rule can lead to polarization. According to political scientists, it can push minority groups into resentment, creating an us versus them mentality. This can lead to the erosion of civil liberties. Take, for example, the war on drugs in the United States, where the majority vote led to policies that disproportionately targeted minority communities. This kind of majority-driven decision-making can strip away the rights of the very people democracy is meant to protect. It's not just about elections. Majority rule also affects laws. In some democracies, the majority can vote to suppress freedom of speech or control the media. The 2010 Hungarian law, for instance, empowered the government to restrict independent news outlets, all in the name of the people's will. The illusion of the majority's wisdom also fails when we consider that many voters are uninformed or misled. In a 2019 study, 40% of Americans couldn't name their vice president, yet they're expected to vote for leaders who make life-altering decisions. This ignorance can lead to the election of leaders who don't have the country's best interests at heart. Democracy assumes an informed electorate, but that's not always the reality. Chapter 2: The illusion of free choice. At first glance, democracy is all about choice. We vote for our leaders, choose policies, and are free to speak our minds. But how free is our choice, really? In today's world, it's shaped by powerful forces, corporations, the media, and the wealthy elite. According to a 2014 study by Princeton University, U.S. political decisions tend to reflect the preferences of the rich more than the average citizen. When big donors fund political campaigns, their interests tend to win out, regardless of what the majority wants. Take the case of the pharmaceutical industry. In the U.S., this sector spent over $4 billion on lobbying in 2020 alone. The result? Drug prices continue to soar, despite most Americans supporting price controls. This isn't a flaw in the system, it's the system working as intended, for the benefit of a select few. The same dynamic can be seen in climate change legislation, where fossil fuel companies spend millions to influence lawmakers. In this way, democracy often serves the interests of the wealthy rather than the will of the people. Media conglomerates play a huge role, too. With a few corporations controlling the flow of information, many voters are only exposed to biased or manipulated content. This creates a distorted sense of reality. In 2016, a study revealed that 62% of US adults got their news from social media, where algorithms prioritize sensational and often misleading stories. The more polarized the content, the more engagement it receives, ensuring voters are misinformed at a massive scale. Even the voting process itself can be undermined. Voter suppression tactics, such as strict voter ID laws and gerrymandering, can significantly limit the choices available to the electorate. In the 2018 midterm elections in Georgia, for example, more than 53,000 voter registration applications were reportedly suspended. This practice disproportionately affected minority communities, thus limiting their access to the democratic process. When these factors are at play, the idea that we have free and open choices becomes less convincing. Instead of empowering citizens, democracy becomes a tool for those with the resources to shape the options available to the rest of us. Chapter 3: Democracy's Hidden Oligarchy. The paradox of modern democracy is that while it promises equality, it often results in inequality. The United States, often hailed as the bastion of democracy, is a prime example. A 2018 study by the National Bureau of Economic Research found that the wealthiest 1% of Americans control more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. This extreme concentration of wealth means that a small elite have outsized influence over political decisions. Think about campaign donations. In the 2020 US elections, candidates and political parties raised over $14 billion. Much of this money came from a handful of billionaires and corporations. This gives them an unbalanced influence over policy and, ultimately, democracy itself. A study by the Center for Responsive Politics found that, in 2016, just 158 families provided half of the political donations in the US elections. This influence isn't just limited to the US. In the United Kingdom, a few hundred individuals and families control a significant portion of the media. The result? These elites can shape public opinion, sway elections, and push policies that benefit their interests. When the media is controlled by a few wealthy families, it's hard to see how democracy can truly represent the will of the people. The rise of lobbyists is another example. In the US, there are more than 12,000 registered lobbyists, with a ratio of 1 lobbyist for every 10 citizens. This means that special interests are constantly pushing their agendas, often at the expense of the average voter. They influence legislation, from healthcare to environmental policy, ensuring that the needs of the few are prioritized over the many. This oligarchic influence on democracy is not just a flaw, it's built into the system. The wealthiest can use their resources to gain political power, reinforcing a cycle where the rich get richer and the poor have less of a voice. As long as money continues to influence politics, democracy's claim to represent the people remains in question. If you're finding this eye-opening, make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated with the rest of our breakdown. Let's continue. Chapter 4, Short-Termism, the poison of election cycles. One of democracy's most dangerous flaws is its focus on the short term. Elections often push politicians to think only about the next vote, rather than the long-term well-being of their country. This short-term thinking results in policies that provide immediate benefits but ignore future consequences. Take, for example, the 2008 global financial crisis. In the years leading up to the crash, many governments pushed policies that favored big banks, focusing on short-term growth while ignoring the risks. Politicians were reluctant to enact stricter financial regulations, knowing that such measures would be unpopular in the short run. The election cycle itself encourages this kind of behavior. In the US, for example, the average tenure of a congressperson is just 9 years. With such a short time in office, there's little incentive to think beyond the next election. This results in decisions that may provide immediate benefits, but avoid addressing deeper issues. For instance, healthcare reform is often put off because tackling the problem would be a major undertaking that might cost votes. Politicians hesitate to make tough, unpopular decisions that could hurt their chances at re-election. According to a 2017 report from the National Bureau of Economic Research, political leaders in democracies are more likely to implement policies that deliver immediate rewards rather than long-term gains. This leads to a dangerous cycle where problems build up over time, but no one is willing to tackle them. For instance, many Western democracies still struggle to address climate change. While the majority of scientists agree that urgent action is needed, politicians often push back climate policies, fearing they will cost jobs or raise taxes, issues that could cost them votes in the next election. The failure to plan for the future is also seen in how democratic nations deal with debt. Many politicians take on short-term borrowing to fund projects, but leave the burden to future generations. In 2021, the global debt reached $226 trillion, a 356% increase from 2000. Yet, most politicians avoid cutting spending on programs that help voters now because they know it would lead to backlash. This pattern reveals that democracy's short-term focus often leads to financial instability and an inability to solve major challenges. Chapter 5, The Tyranny of Polarization in a Democracy. One might expect cooperation and compromise, but the opposite often happens. The rise of extreme polarization is one of the most destructive forces in modern democracies. Political parties, instead of working together for the good of the country, increasingly view each other as enemies. According to the Pew Research Center, political polarization in the US has reached historic levels. In 1994, 64% of Americans said they could accept a member of the opposing party as a neighbor. By 2017, that number had dropped to just 40%. This shift reflects a growing divide, with many voters no longer seeing their political opponents as fellow citizens. This polarization often leads to gridlock, where even the most basic legislation becomes impossible to pass. The U.S. Senate, for instance, has seen increasing difficulty in confirming judicial appointments due to partisan fights. What should be a straightforward process is often delayed or blocked entirely, contributing to a dysfunctional system that cannot address pressing issues like healthcare or infrastructure. Polarization doesn't only harm political cooperation, it also erodes public trust. In 2020, 82% of Americans said that they had little to no confidence in Congress to act in their best interest. This lack of faith in democratic institutions can lead to the public losing confidence in the system as a whole, further deepening divisions. When voters become disillusioned, they're more likely to support extreme leaders who promise quick fixes, even if those leaders undermine democratic principles. Polarization also has a financial cost. A study by the Brookings Institution found that political gridlock due to polarization can reduce GDP growth by up to 1% annually. This means that while politicians are busy fighting over ideological differences, they're failing to pass laws that promote economic stability. Instead of finding common ground, leaders use division to rally their base, which only deepens the political divide and stifles progress. Chapter 6: Democracy's Achilles heel. The people's passivity. A democracy depends on active participation from its citizens. But what happens when the public becomes disengaged or apathetic? The truth is that a passive electorate is a dangerous one. In many democracies, voter turnout is shockingly low. In the US, for instance, voter participation in the 2020 presidential election was high by American standards, yet still only 66.8% of eligible voters cast a ballot. This means that a third of the population was completely uninvolved in choosing the leader of the nation. Even when people do vote, many are uninformed about the candidates or the issues. A 2020 survey by the Knight Foundation found that 39% of Americans could not name a single Supreme Court justice, and 51% of young adults couldn't name their state's senators. When the electorate lacks the knowledge to make informed decisions, the system is ripe for manipulation. Politicians often exploit this by focusing on emotional issues, offering catchy slogans instead of concrete solutions. This shallow engagement undermines democracy's promise of representative government. The rise of misinformation has also made it harder for people to stay informed. In the 2020 US presidential election, disinformation spread across social media, with false stories and conspiracy theories reaching millions. Studies show that fake news is 70% more likely to be shared than factual content. This creates a climate of confusion, where voters are unable to distinguish truth from fiction, weakening democracy's foundation. What's more troubling is that even when citizens are informed, they may still opt out of participation. In many democracies, political disillusionment leads to a sense of powerlessness. A 2021 survey from Gallup found that only 19% of Americans trust the federal government to do the right thing. This distrust often results in low voter turnout and apathy towards civic duties, leaving the system open to manipulation by special interest groups and powerful elites. Democracy's vulnerability to passivity isn't just theoretical, it has real-world consequences. When people stop caring about the system, they stop holding leaders accountable. This leaves a vacuum that can be filled by demagogues and authoritarian figures, who thrive when citizens are disengaged. The more passive a society becomes, the easier it is for democracy to fail. If you found these insights valuable, don't forget to subscribe for more. The truth about democracy is far more complicated than we realize, and we'll continue to uncover the facts you need to know.